Hello.
Hey, man.
Yeah, how are you?
So crowd chat begins.
Beginning of the chatting.
There we go. Oh, it's so this is me and you. Let's jam. It says we can't jam on crowd chat. I can't hear you though.
Still can't hear me?
Jamming on crowd chat.
Jam away. What do you want to play?
I'm trying to learn Tupelo Honey, but it's kind of hard to sing and play.
What's the chord progression?
I got him screwed it up. Look at my capo. Hey, he didn't come to learn technology today. I still can't hear you, Jabe.
It says I'm broadcasting. I can see it. Can you hear anyone?
Hey, he didn't come to learn technology today. I still can't hear you, Jabe. Maybe I should put more.
It says I'm broadcasting.
Live stream out there for everybody. So you're muted. Oh, how about now? Yeah, I don't hear you. Let me make sure I get the YouTube link out there. Our YouTube channel. T.O. Red Hat. Office. Let's do YouTube. Someday I'll be organized on this stuff and so here's the all right, so basically here's where we are. If you want to be part of our YouTube channel, there we go. That's the YouTube channel. And oh, some people, Andrew is joining. Yay. Andrew's here. Andrew's here. What are your thoughts? Andrew?
What's up?
Can I hear you? I can't hear you neither. How come I can't hear anybody?
I can hear you. I can hear
It's
you.
me.
Can you hear me, Jade?
I can hear you all. I had my volume down.
What's up?
Can I hear you? I can't hear you neither. How come I can't hear anybody?
I can hear you.
There we go.
Now we're on the live stream. This is the best intro to. Can you hear me, Jade?
Yeah. Are you there?
I can hear you.
Who's there? Andrew, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Wait, I can't hear you.
I can't hear anybody.
Well, somebody at least. How come somebody can't?
Now we're on the live stream. This is the best intro to. Can you hear me, Jade?
You said that already. Are you there?
I can hear you.
Who's there? Andrew, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Wait, I can't hear you.
I can't hear anybody.
Well, somebody at least. How come somebody can't?
All right. This is the best. Now what?
All right. Oh, that's weird.
Can you hear me now? Let's kill the live stream. I mean, not
Well, I got the
listen to it while we're doing
volume off now on my volume off on the live stream. Yeah, but I still can't hear you. For some reason, you're
Me now? I can hear you. I could hear
okay. For some reason,
somebody booted me.
All right. Well, there we go.
All right, for real now. How's everyone doing?
It's good. Transformation. What the heck?
Transformation is hard. Let's go shopping.
All right, that's simple. All right, there we go. What is your biggest transformation challenge?
Is the answer? Can the answer be Jabe?
Definitely. It's usually Jabe is the answer for why is something wrong. I did a conference this morning and I was with GoToMeeting. Bad.
Why are they still in business? Oh, I'll be the cap.
Bad.
Indeed.
I
KB.
Greetings.
basically they have decided that you don't need to join or present from a Macintosh, which is a bit problematic, I would imagine. But anyway.
Oh, really? It's not a Mac thing?
It should be, but you can't actually use it. It's very weird. I had to call in on my phone and present from my phone. Anyway, such is life. It was still fun.
What platform was that?
It was GoToMeeting. That was
Oh.
not my favorite.
Citrix. It's good. Go to Postal is what I call it.
Yeah.
Screaming match.
What have you guys been up to for the last couple of weeks? I haven't seen you here on the internets talking to everyone.
That's right. We were
We tried to write a book.
a book sprint. Oh, hey, there. Thoughts
That was
about
hard.
book sprints.
Book sprints are hard.
It was really hard.
Yeah.
I thought
I had a good time, but it was really challenging for sure.
They're super diffusing.
I think it's challenging in the same way that sprints are hard. I don't know if you've ever tried to sprint for 2 weeks, but
I've had a thing like that. I used to rant all the time about how deadlines make quality of things go down, and I was like reminiscing as the deadline approached about the way quality and deadlines interact. I don't know, it's just me.
I mean, for me, I thought it was a great way to bring everything I hate about Agile and everything I hate about writing together
Into one thing.
one experience.
Yeah, so like here's one thing I would say, which I know is like everybody will immediately jump on me about, but I'll say it anyway. I think having tried to write for a long time, not having been one of the authors of a book yet, I find it really hard to write, and I wrote a lot of words in 2 weeks. So, kind of in the lines of code metaphor, it was very productive. But I do, on the other hand, I also, as a designer, I have this like thing where I'm like, don't shoot at a thing unless you have the thing. Like, try to like actually materialize something to critique. So it's like more like a balancing thing in a lot of ways. Like I feel like it was really broad and that made it hard, but having a lot of writing all of a sudden wasn't bad. It was just kind of managing it. I don't know.
That's
great
what I
for
would
creating-
that's what I would usually call architecture.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, I mean, I think two things. One, I think for what we try to accomplish, sort of a meta conversation like we did, it's hard. Like if we were just going to put 15 people together and say, let's address a technology area around something, like how do you do Java and Kubernetes or something, and I think then you wouldn't really need a voice. You don't need an arc. But when you're trying to take 15 people, particularly most people who've never written a book before, and certainly not done any collaborative writing, which is another hard problem because there's a lot of empathy that you have to have, right? You can't, like one of the things I found frustrating was you'd write something in context and then somebody come right in the middle of it and say, well, I think this should be like this. And they wouldn't even have the context of like why you were writing that. And it seemed like the book sprint gave you the freedom to do that.
Yeah.
So you wind up having these chopped up things.
I feel like it's a fantastic way to take non-author experts and make a book happen.
Yeah.
Fantastic for that. I think for the ambition that we had for and still have for the project, it's hard to kind of work through things when you're on this deadline with like this outcome that you're trying to get to, where a lot of that stuff needed just a lot more deep thinking to bring it together, and you're sort of on the forced march to a deadline. But I feel like on the conversation of transformation, it was a fantastic opportunity for us to connect to a bunch of our coworkers and do work that will help everyone sort of get on the same language and the same vision for what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I also think like there's like some sort of like process of like, when I used to talk to people about doing like innovation stuff and like innovation sprints and stuff like that, I was like, you have to realize like 60% of what you're doing is literally just trying to let people exercise the bad ideas so that you can kill them. Like if you don't actually let someone express themselves and like work through what's problematic about it, then they just keep that idea in their head. Whereas if you like express it and then you walk through it with somebody, they can see their way around that and not have to kind of hold on to it anymore. So I thought that like I learned
think that's an interesting topic to discuss, because on some level I agree, but as a counterpoint, I think it's actually hard to see with clarity on those compressed timelines
totally, yeah,
the value of a big idea.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, no, I think that you start getting into that race in the second week too, right? Where, I don't know, it just and especially I'll tell you, I don't like the review process either, because again, to create content in like 5 or 6 days, where it's all independent content, and then to have a review process, because you think about a regular book, right? This is a long process, and there's a lot of seeding with the editors and the review processors that you get it over a longer period, so that when you digest it and you decide, well, should this be here or shouldn't this be here, I think you've got a longer absorption of the content, where you have like 6 people writing a ton of content. I mean, 20 people writing, a ton of content in 6 days, and then you have to sort of review it. And I found like these obscure, like why, I mean, even again, not to dump on our book, but like there were like 3 conversations going about who was the right person to attribute for a quote for why transformations fail, and actually that's still not resolved, right? And like, okay, just accept that the reference of the first person's author who put it there, and if you go search the link and it points to the actual company that said it, you actually don't have to change it.
Like I wonder how much of like part of what we wrote about was like creating a common working space with other people as like a way of a kind of prerequisite of platforming. Like I wonder how much trying to work together across teams in these kind of like temporary situations in order to create things like, I don't know, shared data and microservices that are shared among many teams and stuff like that. I kind of wonder how much is it the same skill set we were trying to learn writing that you have to learn to create better software as well.
It's all just words.
I think there's common themes in the sense that you're bringing people together who might have different versions of reality and trying to get them to work together. I think, to the points that were already kind of made, that you shouldn't expect that to be a totally solved problem in 2 weeks either.
Yeah.
That when you're looking at, particularly the complexity and the depth of expertise and balancing all the different interests involved, that you need an ongoing kind of quote unquote recombining cadence that allows that to emerge and optimize itself over time.
Yeah.
Isn't it a lot like just like software development sprints, where like when velocity becomes problematic, all the hard stuff gets pushed to later? So like what we ended up with is, towards the end of the sprint, you end up with all of the unresolvable things all shoved together, and all the disagreements have already happened. So like, what is that? Technical debt? Like, you know what I'm saying? It's like we just forego actually fixing things and push them off, because we kind of have this idea that some other sprint can fix it, or some other group will come through. I just remember being at the end of a sprint and everybody looking at you going, we've got a lot of warts to clean up.
Yeah.
Well, it's even worse, right? Because you don't really have a team, so now the whole thing gets orphaned.
Right.
Like you
And then
create,
you need a hardening sprint.
yeah, you put a bunch of people together to create something, and then they go off and do something else now.
Well, then it has to go through the security review.
Security review, the path to production. Do we support those libraries?
That's right. Yeah.
So what else is going on in the world?
People doing things that they know what the outcomes are going to be, but pretending like they have hope.
I mean, I just feel like every week still gets crazier in 2020. Like we had a bit of a lull, but it's now like we take for granted the numbers that everyone was horrified about in Italy are literally happening in like half a dozen countries right now. And
Yeah.
it's not even a thing.
So I'll nerd out a little bit. Maybe John Willis will like this one. One of my favorite kind of COVID things that happened this week is that Quest Diagnostics got approved to do batch testing. So what that means is that they can take samples from I think it's up to 20 people, and they can mix the samples together and test the whole sample together. And of course, the idea of this is that the positivity rate is significantly less than 20% or something like that. So if you test up to 20 people, you are highly likely to not have anyone in that batch come up positive. And so only if you come up positive do you retest all the individual samples. So what you do is you massively 20 times accelerate the data acquisition rate, because what you're doing is you're basically batch testing at 20 times the speed, and you're only looking for positives before you actually go and do sub-testing. So instead of doing individual tests, you're doing batch testing. I think that's super cool. It's kind of like I guess it's one of the major ways that Hong Kong and China actually managed to accelerate their testing rates so high. So that's cool. At least we figured that trick out after months.
So it's kind of like a Bloom filter-y type of way to
100%. Yeah, totally.
But it also ends up breaking down if your positive rates are too high at some point.
Because the variation and one of the themes through all of this has been is that we have so much undetected positivity, and that the reporting from every state is all wrong. It's ridiculous. So if you assume certain rates of positivity based on your past results, which are flawed in small sample sizes, it could be like the antibody test, where it's a worthless test.
But the beauty of it is you're not doing individual tests anymore. You're doing batch tests, so you're accelerating your data acquisition. So as long as you don't assume the model is right going in, and you adjust the model using a Bayesian approach coming out, you would get to know what the optimal batch size is based on the current infection rate, because the idea is that you'd want to have, in theory, you'd want every other batch test to fail. That's a 50% failure rate, gives you the most information about the system. So if you got there, 50% failure rate of the batches, then you would double the rate of discovering non-positive people, which would be cool.
If you could run continuous back tests, you would actually be able to calculate.
So on the topic of adaptive capacity and transforming organizations, my wife, who's a doctor in Arizona, got a sore throat and then got tested for COVID. And in Arizona, the testing is so backed up that as a doctor trying to get back to work at a clinic, it literally took 7 days to get results for that test. And I mean, I can't imagine what it's like for everyone else, or maybe that's sort of like just par for the course, but at least for the phase that Arizona's had, where we're kind of overrun with the infection rate, then it's backed up all that infrastructure.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I mean, until we have some sort of a test that looks like a pregnancy test, we're not gonna be able to open things. I don't know what people are thinking with that long of a turnaround time, and literally being able to, I'm listening to people say these protocols are really in place in places. So we're reopening the office. And if we have somebody that walks through with COVID-19, we're going to close the place, sanitize it, and then we're going to reopen and expose you to the exact same thing the next day. and literally we have no way of knowing who has COVID-19. And I think the frustrating part is that people's lives, especially receptionists, are getting donated to just be COVID patients. And all the people we have out in front that we that greet, the lowest people typically in the organizational totem pole are being asked to come into offices. It just absolutely makes no sense to me. I mean, how can you know anything?
Yeah, I think this is interesting, watching the response across the world, and kind of relates back to this theme, trying to help organizations, quote unquote, transform, is that you already have great examples, right? Like, you don't need to invent all these things to solve this problem. You have good examples that are really working, whether you're talking about the fact that these kind of experiences that we all have every single day on our cell phones, those processes, it's not that they're not secret, they're not hidden. You can go read about what people that are delivering those things are doing. Most of them are more than willing to share. You can often even get people from those places to come talk to your company and explain exactly what they're doing. And so if you look at what has happened in places that have had success containing the outbreak, they have aggressive contact tracing, they have thermal checkpoints. That's where it gets like sort of interesting, watching some of these protocols where people are like, yeah, we're just going to reopen. It's like, well, do you have temperature checks? No. Okay, well, what are you doing? Well, if someone is symptomatic, then we'll like do this protocol. It's like, have you guys, has anyone, and I'm going to say guys here because I'm going to blame it all on men. Has anyone actually paid attention to like how this thing has spread across the planet over the last 6 months? Anyone?
It's absolutely amazing, and it takes so little to slow its growth. Like, it just takes so little actual effort to slow its growth, and yet the world is in mass confusion about communications. It's literally in a situation where if there's a vaccine invented in a foreign country, we might not actually be able to get it here because of where we're at.
I think it's kind of hilarious, right? That it's one of those things where it's like, we have the technology and we know the practices that are required, but culture, right? Like, literally, the countries that are successful at this have cultures where they'll like, well, we've been through this before, and the last time it didn't work out so well, so we learned our lesson, and we're going to actually not do it again. And it just, the cultural values in the countries that are, resisting doing really basic behavioral change is, it's depressing.
It seems like we may have a generation that's self-selecting to die, or a set of demographic. It's really hard to watch. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I think the other thing about it is that, like, the problem with the disease is it just like actually doesn't kill a high percentage of people that get it. And so really, by not getting it, what you're doing is trying to not kill other people. If you get it, you're unlikely to die. But if you get it, you are highly likely to be part of the chain of events that causes someone to die. And people just don't, seem to have a good understanding of how that works, that kind of common good problem.
That's the morality appeal, right? And that was the thing. I just look at people that, and I'm constantly saying here, we're talking about reopening schools again down here in Florida, and there's dates being thrown around. And, we have a governor down here who's obviously best friends with the president. And the real problem that we're facing is that educators are standing up and saying, listen, solving the economic woes of America is not the job of teachers. And that is not what we're here for. And to throw this on the front line of a battle that we're not trained for. And by the way, look at the percentage of people that are getting it that are trained for this, right? The fact of the matter is the things that we're doing right now that are best practices aren't even good enough. We still haven't admitted this is an airborne disease, not a 6 foot away disease. It's like every foot away you get more helps. So 6 feet is better than none feet. But I don't know. And I'm tired of hearing social distancing. I haven't heard social isolation enough. And that's really where we're at. It's like, go back to SARS travel, go through a Chinese airport, and you will see all of those temperature scanners are still there. All of the things from SARS were not temporary. They did not take them down.
Yeah.
We would take them all down. Like in Florida, we started during the last epidemic. We started a whole epidemiology and epidemic group response team here in Florida. 2 years later, it was defunded because it was a waste of money. That'll never happen again.
Yeah. Well, I've been struggling with, where I live in North Atlanta, they've been trying to decide whether they should go to school, not school, and so on and on.
Yeah.
And then finally, but here's the ironic thing, right? Finally, they decided to go all virtual. But guess what? The sports teams, they're in an uproar now. So they're leaving it up to like Georgia High School Association to make the decision whether they're going to have football or not. I mean, they've already said it's not safe enough for the kids to go to, which is an unlikely decision for a North Atlanta.
Yeah, but it is safe enough.
I mean, we are as red as it gets. Yeah. And, people yell at me at the grocery store for wearing a mask, right? But now they're leaving the football is so strong. And I love high school football. Trust me, I love high school. I love college. It's one of my highlights of the year is high school football. This is one of the best high school football areas in the country, but it's ridiculous that they're leaving it up to the Georgia High School Football Association to decide whether the kids are going to play football. And here's the thing, my son's in band. So I'm totally dependent on whether this group of like people who have only one monogamous focus in their life, which is high school football, to make a decision whether they're going to play football, and they're determining whether my son is going to have to show up and be in the band for these events, which means I'll probably have to move out of my house to live somewhere else during the season, the band season.
Oh God. Yeah. I didn't even think about that. That's like asking Nebraska people whether they want football. I mean,
it's I think I know what the answer is going to be, I mean, one of my wife's friends, she's on all the PTSA and all this stuff. And they're like, are you going to sign a petition? Like, to make sure that they don't cancel football? And I was like, no.
Well, one of the things that's sort of shocking to me personally is watching this evolve, and this also relates to plenty of this other work we try to do about how the lens of people's politics changes literally the facts for them.
Yeah. Oh my word. Yeah.
Yeah. It's crazy.
And without getting into the depths of what side anyone's on, there's lots of people in conversations where it's like everything is sort of questioned, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, or like a reframing where the mask one we already brought up a bit, where people are like, well, it's been proven that the masks don't protect you. It's like, well, it's not for you. And if you actually want to get into the research, it has been shown to be somewhat preventative to the other people. We got a new.
Yeah. Hey, Ian, I took a chance. I'm asking people to at least tweet on the thing first before I accept them, but I figured I'd take a shot on you. Hey, Ian, how's it going?
Hey, how are you?
I'm well, but I don't know you, Ian. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah.
Sure. I'm a design executive. Just moved back about 6 months ago to Raleigh from a brief trip up to Atlanta, and did about 20 years in New York before then. Worked at IBM, worked at MailChimp, had my own agency. So yeah.
I can hear a little bit of New York there.
Tiny bit. I grew up in Boston, so moving to New York after living in Boston, people think I'm from New Zealand at this point. Like, it's a little bit all over the place.
I'm gonna say Kiwi's in there.
Kiwi's in there. I've heard that before. I have heard that before. I mean, the Boston will come out once in a while, but for the most part, it's flattened out all over the place.
Nice.
So my New York, I can't recognize my New York, what I'm stuck with because I grew up in New York, but everybody
has a borough accent. It's hilarious.
It's better than a Rhode Island accent, which is like the worst of Massachusetts and New York.
So what's your take on all this, Ian?
I saw your, I literally opened up Twitter. I saw a Twitter feed that Jabe was talking, and I have no idea what you're talking about, but I was just interested to jump in right in the middle of it.
Perfect.
What do you think? What do you think? What's the most challenging part about transforming a company
Oh,
as a designer?
sure. I think the fact that design has been, well, I would say the positive spin of that is technology has gotten to the point where it's engulfed design to such a point that but designers don't want to deal with that reality, right? So I always tell we're in this place where we have to redesign designers, right?
Yeah.
So when I started off, nobody says like, let's do a checkout cart and let's start from scratch, right? There's 3 patterns at work, right? So you've got APIs, you've got design patterns in code, you've got design patterns that are stagnant. And, most 25-year-olds essentially like think that Figma and AirPods are essentially their design tools for the next 20 years. And the reality is that's just not a tool. People won't speak design. You have to learn how to speak tech, and you have to learn how to speak marketing. So I think that the biggest challenge is that people haven't realized that design's role really just there's only 2 tracks left. There's design as production, and there's design as strategic partner. And the flip side of that is that most companies are moving towards design as production. And while there are huge benefits to having design as a strategic partner, if the company wasn't established that way, it's very, very, very difficult to insert yourself into that process. And it has to be something that executive level sign up has to be on. It's a 3-year roadmap if you're lucky, right? So I think the benefits there, though, if you do that, or if you do have a company is I do think that they're, all people are, but designers are really good why people. And when they're not brought into the very beginning of a conversation and they ask why after everybody else has been banging on it for 3 months, there's some good things that come there, but it's usually just kind of seen as a nuisance. So I think to wrap up the question, your answer, I think the hardest part is really that design doesn't understand that its role has forever changed, and that it needs to accept those and kind of build from that, the whatever vantage point, whether it's production or strategic partner.
That's cool.
I'm so glad you joined. There's kind of this other side of this where the organizations desperately want design. They desperately want to have the ability to do some of this stuff, but they don't understand how to incorporate designers either, right? So there's like this optimal outcome where everyone gets sort of not necessarily exactly what they want, but better than it is now, but people kind of get stuck on that. And this is a recurring theme for lots of these roles, not just design, but I think
100%. Yeah, well, I think that when you say organizations want design, I think when I hear that, and when I've been in a position where I have heard that, you really dig into it. Well, what do you really want?
Yeah.
Do you want something shiny? Do you want velocity? Do you want quality? Do you want to win awards? I would, as far as software is concerned, somebody wakes up one day and says, we need a thing that does a thing. Nobody wakes up and says, we need some beautiful logo, right? You need a thing that accomplishes a task for somebody in a manner. And then I think design can be at the outset of that. But usually I would say most things happen where there's a problem and it's something that's repeatable, and you decide that there's a way to automate it. And design enhances that and can make that a more pleasurable thing that can add value and make sure that people continue to use it or make it more pleasurable. But I have found a lot of times when I hear people say, well, we need design, and you really dig into what they want, and it means very different things to different people.
Yeah, I think the last 20 years of software engineering chased 2 roles out of software engineering: architecture and design. And there's good parts and bad parts about that. Maybe the good part about it is we've reconsidered kind of the design up front theory and kind of moved more towards a continuous design theory, which I think is definitely better for most people, including architects. Kind of like a continuous engagement is becoming more and more important, as opposed to like hey, we can just kind of sit down in a back room and figure out what we need the developers to build.
Sure.
But I do think, like you kind of pointed out earlier, if we can't figure out how to reintegrate those two practices into software development, I think the companies that can't do that are going to be significantly disadvantaged. And the companies, again, I think will get a significant advantage out of it. I don't think everybody has to be Apple, but I think everybody has to figure out how to kind of at least do the work. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, people, since so many things are commoditized and there's 50 tax tools and 100 project management tools, we've got a lot of things out there that make things easy. I harken back to your 20 years, right? And like, I'll date myself here, but like, I was a believer in the promise of the internet, right? And the promise of the internet was like this free information, and we were going to have time, and we were going to kind of live, and that's not the case at all, right? Like, so how do we get back to that promise of the internet? And I think that promise of the internet is this democratization and this community. And I think that when the money got put in there, which money has to go in there, right? Like, that's not to say that the money can't go in there, but in a very like Doug Rushkoff way, like, maybe you're $100 million company. Maybe that's it, right? Like, you don't have to be a $500 million company, or you don't have to be more than a 30-person agency. Like, you can do really good work, pay everybody really well, win all the awards you want. You don't have to continually grow at some exponential rate, because I think that's where a lot of the problems start to evolve, right? Where it's like, well, we got to splinter off, and tech's got to go over here, and design's got to go over there. And, in my 20-year career, the most meaningful and successful work I've done was with a highly collaborative cross-functional team that worked in a very short period of time on a very clear problem. When I've worked on big teams with big problems, the politics get in the way, headcount becomes power, and all that stuff is very real. But if we're just talking about building a good piece of software, give me 4 or 5 really good people, and like, all agree on what the problem is. And like, I'll stay, I'll pull all-nighters till the sun comes up. But, that for me is a lot of the challenge.
You've said a bunch of things that I want to riff on, but I'm going to start with the last thing you said. And that is that when you have this experience and you work on a team that does those things in that way and is really kind of coming together to solve a problem, and it feels like a team, you always miss it when you don't have it. You always want that. Like, once you've tasted that nectar, you suffer when you don't have that.
Because just the one thing I would add to that is, I don't think it's because that like that team was like any more talented.
Absolutely.
I think it was that everybody checked their ego at the front door, and
it was more of a team. It was more of a team.
Yeah, you were a team, right? You just like, you had clarity and you had purpose, and everybody was like, cool, you got the right answer, let's do it.
Well, and it's both though, right? So I've done a few startups too, and it's something about that you actually sort of get a chance to pick your team to a certain extent. That helps. Two, it's people who know how to work on a team, because you don't have to always agree with anybody. Like our team here, like, there's a lot of things we disagree with, and we have we have like long, like, heated debates about our disagreements. But the thing at the end of the day is we have respect and empathy for each other.
Yeah.
So that team members know how to disagree in a way that makes the answers stronger, which there's a lot of people who've never had to work in that collaborative, like, sort of.
The basis of design is critique, right? Or in certain schools. One thing I'd be curious, and I started this conversation a few times with Jay, but I'd be interested in getting your perspective. And it kind of relates back to the comment you made about design means different things to everyone. And I think sometimes design gets oversimplified to like how things look and if they look pretty, versus like fit for purpose, or actually designing this thing in the larger context. I think, because of the internet and the nature of this stuff, it makes it so a lot of the work ends up being about pixels. But I'm curious how you think about that and frame that, Ian.
I guess I would go back and build on what I said earlier. If it's design as production, then it is a lot about, I think the healthier way moving forward is that, what sort of customer experience it's established and what the product manager does, there is a real, hey, we want it built this way and we do want you to paint it. And I think that's a feasible business model. It's a feasible way to do it. Everybody knows their role and everybody does their thing. And honestly, I do think that a lot of the younger designers, and there are a lot of really talented ones, but I do think while, you know, I grew up doing information architecture and UX and design because you had to, because it was the only way you understood everything. I think that a lot of people nowadays don't have to do that. So making it pretty is what they think design is. I think if it's the other thing, if it is strategic, for me, that's the design. The design is like, how do I get you from, you know, there's this old adage of discover, try, buy, which I've said is dead forever, especially as it relates to tools. And that we're in an adage now of find, use.
Yeah.
I want to Google it and I want to use it, get out of my way. Now, if that's the case, that there's no marketing paraphernalia that's sitting in the middle that tells me why I should use it and how I should use it, then you better have a really amazing onboarding, a really amazing data set to get me started. Airtable does this amazingly, right? Their brand degrades from the website into the product beautifully. Then when you kind of understand what you're doing, you kind of like, you just basically download a data set and you're already kind of playing with it and they're out of the way. Right. So I think that for me is the type of design I like doing. Right. And the type of design I think that you can strategically do, where it's a little bit of customer experience. It's a little bit of design. It's a little bit of code. I think it takes people who have been around the track long enough to realize that. I remember working in the restaurant and somebody telling me, like, you know, your best friend, if you're in the front of the house, is not the head waiter. Right. The best friend is, like, you know, the first line cook. Like, make that person your friend, right? So that's crossing over into technology, it's crossing over into marketing, and it's speaking all those other languages. So I would say, again, I think if on the production side, yeah, it is making it pretty. And I think I've seen places where that works really well. There are, like, when I worked at Razorfish for a while, and the most valuable person I had was a senior production designer. And he just took everything, cleaned it up. It was on point. It aligned with the design principles. Like, he didn't want to do any of that strategic thinking, but he did all that dirty work that made it go through the phases of design really, really well, right? You go through the 4 phases of design. You go through learning how to design, learning how to communicate design, learning the business of design. And then for a few vaulted John Maidas and whoever, you become a mentor of design, a thought leader for design. I think a lot of times just true design it skips over that communication line, and it never really even understands the business side. So I would just kind of echo what I said earlier, but I think there are some nuances there.
I think, you know, listening to you, I'm thinking about, like, the way, like, a lot of the stuff we end up playing with these days is, let's just say YAML. YAML is a thing that we do a lot. And, like, the ease of use of YAML is maybe not the highest ease of use thing I've ever interacted with. So, like, there's this like moment that we're in right now where, like, saying things like developer experience actually starts to make sense. It's not just like, oh, we want to do user experience, but for developers. It's actually a thing now. And I think you were describing a little bit around kind of Airtable, kind of this idea that we really, like, when we're designing APIs, when we're designing infrastructure, when we're designing anything self-service inside the enterprise, these should be primary goals. There's just, like, in the past, I've done a bunch of work around what's called consumerization in IT, and it's a really simple thing to explain. It just basically says, like, a lot of kids these days, when they go to work, a lot of young people, when they go to work, they would literally rather go to Starbucks because they can actually get on the Wi-Fi there. And they can't get on Wi-Fi at work. Yep. The BYOD insanity is just so painful. They're just like, I'd rather go down the street and work. And so, like, all of like getting that to work inside of IT as a way of saying what good looks like includes these kind of experiential design aspects. I think that's something that, like, again, it moves beyond, like, the portal for getting onto the Wi-Fi should be branded well to no, it should be an experience that you're having that's like as good as at least going to a place where you have to pay for it down the street. I don't know. I think there's a bunch of stuff to think through in there, but anyway.
Hey, Nick, you want to just introduce yourself? I know you're having fun listening, but
I am having a blast listening. So I consider myself a complete noob to this. But I consider myself dev adjacent. So my background is largely in ops and some architecture, but also I understand what you guys were saying about the role where you interface with a lot of other roles, including the business and security, the financial guys for project funding. And I think that's an important role that's more of a, to use Gartner's term, kind of a versatile approach to being interested in a lot of different areas, deep in a few, but then really bringing some value to the team by being able to interface with people across those lines.
Nice.
Do you guys, when you're thinking of design, do you also think more broadly in terms of the design of like I know you were talking about getting on Wi-Fi as an experience, but the experience of what it's like to work. So for example, with the rise of the COVID panic and the vast decentralization of the enterprise that's resulted, I've noticed that there's two camps of people who have formed out of it. One of which I term the extroverts, are desperate to get back into the office and mix it up and and be together with more people, and a whole other group of individuals that are like, this is the most productive I've ever been in my life. I love this, and if I can swing it, I'll never walk back into an office again. So how you create an experience for developers or for anybody who's on a product team, right? When you have either the hybrid model where you got some people in an office and the rest of them are satellites, or just a pure satellite model where nobody's in an office, but you still want to create that team cohesion and that sense of trust and psychological safety, the things that we have been shown to lead to highly productive teams in a manner that's not traditional, not the way that everybody kind of grew up doing things.
I think this is kind of the thread that Jay was starting, where, and I'd be curious to hear what Ian thinks as well, is like, you look at all these things, beyond the pixels, the experience that you have getting on Wi-Fi, the experience that you have, even as you move through a space and see how the desks are laid out. And that's before you get to things like how organizations are designed and what the facilitation of the communication and the rest of it is. And I would say that those are inadvertent design decisions that are made constantly without anyone really considering it or acting like it's a design process. Most of it is kind of accidental in most organizations.
Isn't technology from an organizational standpoint one of the most unexamined work experiences there are? Like, in terms of, like, if you think about it, they're not designed, they just happen. The relationships between working groups are largely stereotypical and just repeated from organization to organization, and none of them work. And yet we see consultancies come in and optimize them, and somehow they can operate with less people. And I used to, Gene Kim and I used to talk about back in the early days when we did some research back around 2004, 2003, started noticing that there was a lot of organizations that could just control a crap ton more infrastructure with less people. And one of the things I used to always say, and I think Gene used to say this as well, is that there's no way that any sane person would go out there and just say, I'm going to cut my staff in half to increase my server sysadmin ratio. Right? Like, you can do that, right? And American enterprises largely do that in this sociopathic way that they called optimization, where they bring in a third-party consultant that literally doesn't know what people do, and they use job description bingo cards, right, that don't reflect what anybody does, that may be 3 positions before what they did, and they use this to optimize the amount of workers at the point of work when they don't know what they do or how long they do it or how much of their work is actually even required. It's an absolute mess. We would never run a manufacturing floor or any other kind of business this way, and yet we bring manufacturing techniques into technology to try and exercise management control. Because here's the thing, when you say design and management, there's a lot of people that think design means control. Yep. So, and when it talks about organizational designs, A lot of executives are saying, who controls the way this org does work?
Yeah.
And so if you ask people when you go into companies, because I maintain that all org charts are hypotheses, ask somebody when you go in there how they know whether the hypothesis was true or not after 15 years. Right? It's because when they get their benchmark data, they show they need to trim a few people here and there to look like the last people that got their benchmark data and then got trimmed by another consultancy. It's insane. And yet we're the smartest people.
I think, look, one of the things about design, I've said a couple times in the past that I think a lot of software engineers have a really interesting and insightful grasp on design in a way that most designers don't have. And part of it is because the iterations, like the rate at which you can actually iterate in software is significantly higher than in like product, for instance. But the one thing I would say is that like designers are trained, it points back a little bit to what Andrew said. Designers are trained pretty early in their careers that they need to be constantly getting critique. And part of the reason for that is that designers get like obsessed, just like software engineers do, with the thing that they're doing. And they basically kind of learn how it works for themselves. And it's kind of like a little micro form of expert entrapment. They teach themselves how the thing works. And if you let them go for too long without being critiqued or showing it to somebody, by the time they actually show it to somebody, if that person doesn't know how it works, they look at that person and go, you're an idiot. It's not my fault that this isn't designed poorly. You're just dumb. And so part of the trick is getting that critique to work. And I think software engineers are awful at that particular thing. And I don't mean awful at like, doing demos. I mean awful at like showing their code to other people in a regular way, showing their APIs and receiving critique. And I think that because of the way the software engineers work, they tend to say, in answer to critique, they tend to say, well, if you wanted it different, you should have specified it different or told me exactly what you wanted in the beginning. Because otherwise, what did you expect? I built what you told me to. All of which in design would never fly. You'd never get away with that. Go ahead, Andrew.
I would think another thing that's interesting to watch is we talk about, sorry, my son's yelling on me. we talk about iterations, but almost no one does iterations, right? So even if you have a critique, like that's not on the burn down anymore, like that's gone. So when people say iteration, they're actually deceiving themselves. Most people are doing increments. They're doing incremental development where they layer stuff on top of itself. They never revisit, through the lens of a criticism, anything that could be improved.
Yep.
Right.
They want a confirmation at the end of every sprint. They don't want a disconfirmation. They don't want to be invalidated. They want to be validated. And their plans show it because they never plan for recovery from being proven wrong. Anyway.
There's no hypothesis, right? It's essentially that you're going to deliver these things with this way. Like here's the story. So you almost set that developer that you just admonished to do the thing that you're admonishing them for, because if they didn't do the thing that you told them to, then they were wrong the other way.
100%.
And all of that sounds like the stuff that we hate ops people for in the world of DevOps, right? Back in the day, it's all that you should have thought about this in the beginning. You should have told me this, right? The only reason I believe designers can, or software developers can be more clued in, or not the only reason, but a large reason, they're very comfortable with embodying emergent design, right? And the only bad part about that to me is that it's done in a complete vacuum often, because when we tend to work in groups, we split off and work by ourselves, right? Then the answer to that is pairing. It's always the opposite pendulum swing. And I'm tired of this. It's like a binary thinking that we do. And we're designers, it's like there's no notion of the role of the designer in an organization as a practicing, like bedside manner for a physician, right? Like you have to be able to take critique, and it cannot have a fire back. Like literally you just need to take it like punches. And when I remember in wrestling, right? How do you know when your abs are perfect? Taking punches, right? You got them sufficient, right? So like, I just think that, there's no punch taking. And to Andrew's point, we call things experiments and or iterations, and they're not. And then all we do to prove we have agile is rail against waterfall.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, none of it's true. Like none of it's true. None of what people say they're doing is really 100% what they're doing. And like we have a hard time with tacit in our world. So when we're sharing our practices, we have to realize that tacit beliefs, a lot of times we can't even uncover them ourselves. Like they take group, so when I watch people talk about roles and we talk about behaviors and archetypes, I think a lot of this is that we have a modern reality that's being addressed by like 1950s thoughts about how organizations put together. It just does not make any sense.
Hey, Mike, no Giants fans allowed in the Zoom session.
Oh,
Mike,
man, he got busted.
Mike Cavus. Hey, you guys know Mike?
Mike's on mute. He's trying to talk. I think they've muted.
Oh.
Hey, Mike.
I'm in the Giants man cave, so it's
I know Mike way back, early cloud stuff, man. Where you at? You're at Deloitte now, or?
Yeah, about 2.5 years.
Okay. And Chris, we all know Chris. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Chris.
Oh, yeah. If I could make a little more empathetic plea, just with the change initiative I'm dealing with now, and it ties into my aquarium stuff too. That's one of my aquaponic systems in the back. But the boundaries that these things can endure, just the range of metrics, I'll say, that won't kill all my fish and plants or disrupt my change initiative with wherever I'm working, is that it's got to be slow, especially from a socio-technical perspective. I am real gung-ho with serverless, and there's a lot of Kubernetes and cloud stuff going on, but people need time to adapt. And if we change it too quick, then it's going to hurt real bad. But from an agile perspective, when we say, well, this, we map out something, we've got a pretty solid map we're following now, and I have to keep reminding people it's probably a 3 to 5 year plan. This isn't a 6 to 18 month thing. And that sounds very waterfall to a lot of folks. So trying to reconcile some of that and keep it incremental and make sure we're not injecting more change than we have to at any given time. So and this is a pretty standard practice in industry right now. I've had this conversation with a few shops, but are we looking to lift and shift into app service and then refactor into managed Kubernetes? And how are we going to leverage serverless from there? Do we want to go straight into serverless? Do we want to go straight into something like AKS, EKS? How fast do you want to go? And the way I've been running experiments around that is just to create opportunities for folks. Here's how you can get Minikube set up on your laptop. Here's how you can spin up an AKS cluster in our sandbox. Or if you're just really good at Java and want to submit a PR, we can handle all that in the pipeline. Not everybody has to worry about it. And it's hard to build confidence within the org in general, various places I've worked, that they have a level of autonomy. I can't remember who said it online. It's on Twitter this week, but from our forming strategy, really what I'm trying to do is present people the options, but I'm looking for the frontline workers to make decisions and to have some agency and own those decisions. And I think that's when you really start seeing amazing work. And it's tough, but true. Some people are going to engage with that more. Others may not have the bandwidth or interest, and that's fine. That's part of requisite variety within an ecosystem.
Yeah, I think when I was training for a marathon a long time ago. I weighed less back then, and I was talking to Josh Karevsky about it because he was doing tennis, and there's these really fascinating kind of curves that have to do with optimal performance. And basically, what they say is if you don't exercise enough, you actually lose performance, and if you exercise too much, you not only lose performance, but you can't actually exercise. So you lose on both sides of the curve. You literally kind of have to take a couple days off. So you don't get the benefit of doing any exercise. So that's a loss, and you injure yourself. So you get a double whammy. So there's this optimal place to sit inside of any sort of kind of attempt to transform your body, which has to do with like pushing it right up to this edge without kind of knocking it over the other side. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting to talk about was this idea that almost all, like, at least marathon training, has something to do with like they push you to different plateaus and then they let you integrate into that plateau. And so it's like a punctuated equilibrium thing. Like they push you to a place where you're stable, like roughly, like you have to have the right bone density to muscle density, muscle strength in order to kind of perform well in a marathon. So they push you to a place where you won't, if they make you run at this rate, you're unlikely to get bone shin splints, damage your bones, but you are likely to kind of start exercising your aerobic strength. And then once you hit that plateau, then they push you harder again. They make you go from 5 miles to 10 miles. Now that's going to mean that you're going to beat your bones harder, which means that you're going to have to re-strengthen your skeleton. So there's this like back and forth tick-tocking where you don't want to push on the same place all the time. And I feel like there's a lot to be said for thinking through that kind of as a set of practices inside of an organization where you need to realize like you can't just sit down and do TDD 100% and expect that to actually work without a set of other practices that are associated with TDD also being kind of pulled up at the same time. And then, maybe that's not the focus you need to have right now. Maybe you need to move it somewhere else. So I think there's some interesting things to be said about kind of maybe the difference between going slow and allowing for periods of integration, I guess.
In certain communities, people would refer to this as specific adaptation to imposed demand.
Yeah.
And the other thing to keep in mind when you start talking about this kind of stuff is that those parameters that you're talking about for what will get you out of that band of quote unquote optimal, depending on what you're trying to train for, changes as you go through the curve. So the types of things that you can put yourself through as you get closer and closer to the marathon are very different. And this is actually a talk I kind of did for the DevOps Enterprise Summit. The DevOps Progressions covers a bit of thought around this. And essentially the thing you want to make, like what people consider fast or a lot is actually not fast or a lot in another context.
Right.
And what most organizations actually need is not the Olympic lifting regimen. They need the couch to 5K version
100%.
of transformation.
Well, interval training will kill you a lot less than just going in and picking up metal. And I think that's one thing that we've seen is that when folks actually figure out what their bodies can uptake, right? Because there's a lot of things that are super fine lines in our bodies. I think one of them that kind of bends my brain is that people are continually messing with is their own pH. People are trying to actually manipulate their pH by drinking water that's, way alkaline. And the thing I have to tell people is listen, if you've ever had a problem with your body acidity, the way it works is that your bones are calcium and your body maintains its acidity very, very precisely. So when you start screwing with things, you have no idea what's going to happen. And I guarantee you, your acidity won't go down. So like it has to do with the whole ecosystem and a lot of knock-on effects inside of your body, right? Some of the things inside of your body they don't share your DNA. They're not even you technically, like your mitochondria, right? And so I think that when we start to talk about change in communities,
they're like outsourced consultants.
They're Hessians. They're Hessians, and you got to keep them healthy, right? Or else they turn on you. And so I think, and by the way, they're responsible for our energy generation and ATP and a whole bunch of things from a cellular perspective. And so I think that when you're talking about change in community or you're talking about change in yourself, people don't realize that uptake of what your body can handle is the ultimate measure. Just like I believe uptake at the end of the day is the only thing that matters in a company rather than velocity. Like if people are putting out a lot of stuff, velocity is really dangerous. People don't understand that it means covering large amounts of something in very short times. And so people don't adapt to that kind of stuff. So if you've got continuous delivery with no tie to uptake, you have a huge waste cannon, right? And so the same thing in ourselves where, like Jay was saying, we can go out and I can start trying to run sprints, 4-4-40s, like I just can't do that, right? It's not going to happen. And I think the problem is that at the enterprise layer, executives get involved. And if you've noticed one thing about executives, they never purport to be amateurs at what they do. So literally there is no notion of training to get where you're at. There is no notion of repetitions in a company. They don't exist. And so we talk about this, and that there's no way to address it.
So one of the challenges that I'm seeing, so I'm in consulting, so throw darts at me now, but there's too much local optimization, right? So we're in all these silos, and each silo has its own island of processes around it, aligned with their goals and objectives, which don't align with the other islands' goals and objectives. And most of the transformation is just within those islands, what's in their control.
Totally.
So, we've all read the goal, right? So you're not tackling the biggest bottlenecks. And a lot of times what happens is we're just creating new bottlenecks. So I had a client, it's one of my favorite stories when I try to tell people that DevOps is not equal to CI/CD, it's much bigger, is they spent a lot of time on CI/CD and they got to where they could push button deploy in minutes, right? The problem is, we did a value stream map, regardless of what the problem was or the feature was, there was 30 to 60 days of process before they could hit that button, and another 30, 60 days of process after they hit the button to put it in production. And that's because these are all legacy silos and processes built for biannual releases on a mainframe. And they never addressed that. Just they created a cloud team that did great, wonderful things, but it's still taking 120 plus days to deploy anything. And so, that's what I see is just the local optimization all the time, and no one taking a step back and looking at the system. And the reason is because it's political, right?
And it's hard.
It's political, and we already touched on politics a little earlier. That it's like basically people have different versions of the facts.
Totally.
But this is a reoccurring theme. I've seen different versions of this movie where the rate limiting step has nothing to do with technology for this thing, but you're not revisiting the process that you inherited from whatever thing, and doing so would require crossing over into these organizational boundaries and having hard conversations with people who have literally defined themselves by this job they do. And so that kind of just brings everything not to a grinding halt, but things move a lot slower than they should.
And I think really quickly, I think the thing that gets missed in what you just said, Andrew, is that like I sometimes I think about like when they say scaling agile, what do they mean? Like what would we want? And I think
they mean agile failed, or else you wouldn't say that word. But anyway,
but
it did not scale. Yes.
if we bring it back to the beginning of the conversation, ideally what we would like is to have like a larger group of people capable of having that amazing team experience. Maybe is what we would want out of it, right? So what we want to scale is negotiating, cooperating, finding things out together, discovering things, learning together. All those things are what we want to scale. Really? But what people try to scale is rituals and processes. Even though Agile like rants that they're not a process or oriented theory, what is scaled when people try to scale Agile is a bunch of rituals, killing and waving chickens over things,
what they think is different, right?
And the part of it is that, even when you have the observation that what's broken is local optimization of processes, the way to fix it isn't to get better at processes. It's to get better at negotiating and learning. That's what you need to get better at. And then you can have some lightweight process around it.
Bring it back to this design thing, that like redesign the process.
100%.
Redesign. Yes.
So how do you negotiate your way up the org chart if you don't have buy-in from high enough in the chart in the organization?
I think that part of what I would say, not that I can answer the question completely right now, is that when we're doing transformations, if we're not aligning, if we're not doing lateral alignment, in other words, getting the organization's CIOs and VPs and things like this talking to each other, then you're not really transforming. You're doing kind of local optimizations in each of the branches of the organization. And that I don't think it works. I don't think it's possible to get there. Anybody who is going to get any value out of the local optimization has already extracted all the value. If they haven't, I'd be shocked. The problem they're having right now is extracting the value out of the cooperation and productive negotiations with other parts of the organization. And that's the next challenge. That's the scaling challenge. The scaling challenge doesn't have anything to do with being able to, have a better stand up every morning.
Some organizations are large enough that you can have meaningful changes, under the leadership of one subsection and do better work and have better kind of teaming and all the rest of this. But if those sponsors are not aligned at the executive level, the chance that everyone's going to be aligned on the work floor is pretty much zero. So finding, this is advice that people kind of made platitudinal over time, but it's like, if you can't change the way people are going to work, then change where you work. And there's like lots of places that want to do better things. So
I just a couple points was like, one, recently I was talking to a company and they were like, can you give me some examples of when you've seen agile work really well from, a design organization that like had more than like 30 people or 40 people all the way through to delivery. And I was like, yeah, I've never seen it happen. Like, and that was an answer they didn't want to hear. I was like, I've never seen it happen well. I've seen bits and parts of it. I've seen the dev process work really well, but I've never seen it done really well from soup to nuts. And that's not any judgment on Agile itself, nor judgment on the organization. I just think we haven't figured out to do that, or I haven't been in organizations that have done that well. And the second part to kind of this change thing is like, one of the things I always go into an organization is try to suss out, there's three things you can do in an org. You can figure out the game, like, so you're at IBM or you're at Red Hat. It's like, okay, this is how so-and-so, and you can play that game. You can be an agent of change, which means you kind of reduce, or you can be an agent of change, which means high risk, high reward. And that's a game you have to play, or you can reduce your scope, And so if you kind of figure out who's playing what role, for me, that's always been seeing what that makeup of people is. That for me has been a leading indicator on whether the change initiative is going to be successful or not. Because it's a Machiavellian, aspect to that of just like, who's going to really get on this, no matter how painful the change might be necessary. I think people at the end of the day are going to go where their bread is buttered, and there's fear and anxiety. Like essentially, like, we should be managing against fear and anxiety internally and managing against fear and anxiety for the customer. That's where the change comes in. Everything else is just kind of like levers that we pull to manipulate those two things.
Safety.
So,
Psychological safety is what.
Yeah, for sure.
So we're going to try to do this every Tuesday. So Ian and Mike and Chris and Nick, put it on your calendar and let's continue this because we're a little over now, but it's been fun. So
thanks so much for having me, guys.
Yeah, well,
nice meeting you, man. Thanks.
We'll try to do this every Tuesday. So, and Mike, I know you got in late. I know you have a lot of thoughts, and I'd love to. So, see if if you're around next Tuesday around the 2:00 East Coast time, we should be firing it up again. So, yeah, come around. At least this time I'll know who you guys are when I see you pop in on our thing. And get select. So, this was great, and look forward to seeing you guys maybe next Tuesday.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks for putting this together.
Yep. Bye bye.
Ciao.